February 1606, the Tower of London. As a small man, reeling in pain, is being stretched over the rack, the interrogators and rack master share a look with one another. They are realizing that laying in front of them is the man responsible for hiding every single Catholic priest in England. Only a few short years earlier, the ancient faith of the island had been outlawed. Priests were exiled. Those that stayed were hunted, tortured, and murdered. Their entire network relied on a handful of dedicated laymen who were tasked with hiding them. In this dark, damp, stinking room, if these interrogators, through enough exposure and torture, could get this man to confess, they could bring down the last remnants of the Catholic Church, snubbing it out forever in England. After a series of cascading events, ever leading in the direction of rupture, King Henry VIII formally breaks with Rome in 1537. Through the regency rule of his heir, Edward, measures were taken which solidified the continental Protestant reforms within the English Church. Then, after a short reprieve under Henry's daughter Mary, the crown fell upon his other daughter, Elizabeth. Elizabeth, ostensibly Protestant in both aesthetics and belief, herself ever shifted the Church of England away from its ancestral faith, ever toward a reformed episcopacy. Even before the ill-fated invasion of the Spanish Armada, Elizabeth had been clamping the vice, adding pressures to an already decimated Catholic population. Pogroms were carried out. Churches were ransacked. Their beloved relics and images were smashed, desecrated, and destroyed in an orgy of pyres. Catholics were increasingly left with little option but to flee, convert, or to hide with an ever-growing group of dissidents known as the recusants. By the time of Pope Pius V's bull declaring that all Catholic subjects no longer owed allegiance to Elizabeth in 1570, and the Spanish Armada in 1588, the die was cast. Elizabeth and the religious fanatics in her court had all the ammunition they needed. Any priest that didn't immediately begin praying the sacrilegious ordinal would be guilty of treason, and any subject aiding these priests would be guilty as well. Torture and execution of Catholic dissidents became commonplace. On March 25, 1586, young 29-year-old wife and mother, Margaret Clitheroe, herself a convert to the ancient faith, having been raised in the new Reformed Church, was found by Elizabeth's henchmen to be hiding priests. Without trial or due process, they then and there drug her into the street. Laid her on the ground, on her back, atop a sharp rock that poked into her spine. They then placed their own front door over and added weights on top until the crushing pressure and the rock broke her back and she suffocated. It was an absolutely agonizing death. Elizabeth herself was said to be appalled at the carnage taking place, yet she never gave the order to stop the violence being carried out in her name. All throughout the countryside, the availability of the sacraments dried up. Where there was no sacerdotal priesthood, the people longed for grace. They began to get desperate for priests, but how could they get them? With the laws becoming ever stricter, housing one could very well mean property seizure and death. They needed a saint. That saint would come in the form of the most unlikely of figures. Born in 1562 to a devoutly religious family, Nicholas Owen had only ever known his faith to be one persecuted by his country's government. Trained as a young boy to be a joiner, the equivalent of what we would today call a carpenter, he was a precocious young man, devout, hard-working. He was also exceptionally small, probably the size of what we will call a dwarf today, and he walked with a hobble. Young Nicholas became involved early on in the recusant Catholic network, working with soon-to-be martyred Jesuit priest Edmund Campion and Father Henry Garnet. By age 25, he began to construct hideouts in people's homes. For 18 years, Nicholas Owen would perform his regular labor by day, and then at night, under the guise of Little John, he would work by himself into the wee hours of the night. He constructed these hideouts, which would become to known as priest holes, for the sole sake of hiding England's remnant priests and their liturgical articles. He never built one hole the same as the next, in order to prevent the henchmen from learning where to look. One can still travel and visit these many of these homes today. They stand as a pilgrimage and a testament to the astonishing work of this one man's brilliance, his dedication to the faith, and to the task at hand. Multiple priests, over the course of many years, would themselves be cramped into these confined spaces. Sometimes days would pass before they could come out. Then, in the cover of night, quietly, and always under the threat of raid, these priests would minister to the faithful, hearing confessions, marrying couples, administering baptisms, chrismations, and most importantly, bringing them Christ in the Eucharist. They would come out for a few precious hours and then return for hour after excruciating hour to the holes they had been assigned. Before her death in 1603, Elizabeth herself was all too aware that right under her very nose, these recusants were, as far as she was concerned, making a fool of her. She decided that the only allowable religion would be the state-sanctioned religion, with its ordinal that had abolished the sacramental priesthood under Cranmer's reformer-minded changes. As a result, she loosened restrictions on her spies and minions so that they could carry out an interrogation and terror campaign against the Catholic population. James of Scotland, originally promised to be a great unifier, was showing himself ever more to be hostile to the ancient faith. As a result of all the pressures, desperate Catholics devised the famous Gunpowder Plot in 1605, designed to assassinate both king and parliament. As a result, henchmen were dispatched all over the country. With increased pressure, people began to crack. Word began to leak. And in January 1606, the home of Nicholas Owens was raided. Though Nicholas and other recusants were hiding, the henchmen would wait for hours, days, in these homes, waiting for sounds, for anything to give away the hidden men. The home's occupants, the Addingtons, denied over and over any knowledge of any whereabouts, but the lackeys had been dispatched by Robert Cecil, Earl of Salisbury himself, and they were not about to go home empty-handed. So they waited, and they searched. After 3 days, they found what they referred to as, quote, popish trash, that is, the relics or the vestments or some other articles used for Mass, and the home was threatened to be upended when the men gave themselves up. They even went so far as to claim that they were themselves the priests, in an attempt to stop the henchmen from further house raids, though it didn't work. Eventually, Nicholas was brought to the Tower of London, where his work and knowledge became known to the captors. As the sole maker of the prized priest holes, he knew the potential location of every single priest within the country. In a matter of hours, men could be dispatched and the entire faith destroyed forever. All they had to do was get him to talk. The rackmasters were infamous for their sadism. They relished in administering the type of torturous pains that make most men squeamish just to hear about. This being such a prized catch, one can imagine the delights they took as Nicholas Owen's hernia began bulging out of his stomach from the force of the stretching. A metal plate on the rack that was strapped to him was said to drive into his intestines, at a point ripping into them, causing his guts to fall out of his stomach. Despite all of this, despite every effort to make him as pains-lasting and excruciating as possible, bringing him just short of death, the interrogators got nothing. Absolutely nothing. Nicholas Owens never talked, never gave a single name, never a single location. After several days of this treatment, he passed on to his eternal reward. The Catholic Church in England had been spared. Jesuit priest Father Gerard, known for his wonderful work, The Diary of a Hunted Priest, who had been friends with and had spent many hours hiding in the holes Nicholas Owens had made, had this to say about the martyred saint. Quote, "I verily think no man could be said to have done more good of all those who labored in England's vineyard. He was the immediate occasion of saving the lives of many hundreds of persons, both ecclesiastical and secular." You're not likely to find any great statues or monuments or churches erected to St. Nicholas Owens. There are no large devotions in his name, no great feast days in his honor. He carries out his work today among the church triumphant, much like he carried out his work when he was alive for the church militant. Quietly, without fanfare or people to acknowledge or even know the work he was doing. Yet in some ways, this man, said to be so short in stature, towers over the tallest and strongest amongst us in courage and in fortitude. And so much as the Catholic Church is alive and reclaiming its former historic place in England today, it owes a great deal of debt to the small lay Jesuit who labored silently by night that Christ might be brought to the faithful. St. Nicholas Owens, pray for us.